Hello, friends. So this is not a talk about computers. This was a pandemic lockdown hyperfixation of mine. I ended up researching everything I could get my hands on the history of safecrackers in New Zealand. So I'm going to tell you some stories and introduce you to some characters from roughly a century of safecracking. Any resemblance to the security industry is purely coincidental. Okay. So let's start June 1921. William Maxted stands in the dock at Darlinghurst Courthouse, charged with breaking and entering the warehouse of Marcus Clark department store in Newtown, Sydney, and the North Strathfield railway station. He's been caught on the roof of the Balmain Co-op department store in March of that year, and they searched him and then his apartment, and they found railway tickets, cash, and an array of really unmistakable burglars' tools: skeleton keys, rubber finger stalls, gel ignite, detonator caps, a battery which was used as a charge for the detonators, and a pamphlet on the use of explosives. So, realising he's caught, he cops to the two charges, and he's sentenced to 2 years at Bathurst Jail, and another 11 charges for various shop breakings around Sydney's inner west are dropped because of the guilty charges. Now, a sharp-eyed court reporter who had previously worked for the Auckland Star recognised William Maxted, or rather, he recognised Joseph Thomas Christie. This stocky young Kiwi lad had a bit of a colourful past in New Zealand. He'd been a bright and mischievous boy who'd grown up in institutions around the country, or rather absconding from institutions. So some of his criminal antics had included repeatedly running away from Burnham Industrial School, jumping off a moving train transporting him to the new Invercargill Borstal. He did the same stunt again on his way to Mount Eden Jail in Auckland while handcuffed to 2 officers. He escaped from a ferry taking him to Littleton Jail. When World War I broke out, he was in Mount Eden prison at the time, but he convinced him he'd be of better service to the nation serving in the army, and then absconded from the military camp. And when he was recaptured for that, months later, working as a scoutmaster in his hometown of Masterton, he was caught and then convinced the judge that clearly he had an uncontrollable impulse, and the only thing that would cure this impulse was to be sent to an asylum, which he quickly made a skeleton key for the front door and basically came and went as he pleased. So he had this history of going on these jaunts. He lived off the land, stole chickens and other sort of, colourful capers, pulled a few cons. He was mostly a nuisance. But now, in spite of this, he had a long history, so 15 years of all these things, but he barely warranted a mention. Like, one day I want to write a book on this guy because there's basically nothing. And when he was mentioned, it was like, suburban papers writing about how he had, the face of a Sunday school teacher, or what does it say there? You could be taken for a Sunday school teacher. He's mostly harmless. But now, with these new charges and this new reputation, the papers didn't just report on his criminal past, they embellished it. They took stories from other criminals and ascribed them to Christie. He'd become this particularly sinister and notorious outlaw character because he was now probably the most feared and fascinating class of criminals. He was a safecracker. And at this time, the public was enthralled with safecrackers. There were these stories about these cunning gentleman cracksmen like A.J. Raffles and Arsène Lupin, who were endlessly written about, and other people would take these characters and write their own stories, and they were adapted to stage and screen, and the public wanted to know these, wanted to hang on every word. There was always these charming aristocrats who didn't need to steal, but they were just driven by the curiosity and the urge to just break in to show they could and teach someone else a lesson. And just for the thrill of it. And the newspapers really picked up on this popular sort of fictional creation of the daring and dangerous, sophisticated criminal burglar. And they'd always report these stories. It's really interesting going back through historical newspapers, because these stories that referred to a recent burglary, usually in Paris or London, they'd be repeated in different newspapers, almost word for word, or there'd be a different story that had similar but very vague descriptions of this recent crime. And the same stories are published for about maybe 20 years in syndication in different papers. So these crimes can't have been particularly recent, if indeed they even happened at all. They're always describing these scientific burglars with the latest methods. So for a little bit of context around safecracking, so the hype around these daring and ruthless safe breakers goes back to the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, where the Chubb brothers had their patent detector lock on display with an invitation to come and pick it. It wasn't the first invitation for the public to try and pick an unpickable patent lock, but this was a big one open to the public at this really well-attended World's Fair. And it proved so popular that these booths became like a real fixture at expositions and world fairs, with different locksmiths taking part for years afterwards. And they would even go as far as hiring their own lockpickers to go and break the competitor's lock to prove that theirs was not as safe as it seemed, and ours is unpickable compared to that one. So they're sort of trying to undermine the competition through these challenges. So, I mean, these things were hardly real life yet. I think there was like a 1 month time limit that you could use to pick a lock, which isn't necessarily the same that a real criminal would have in real life conditions. But they led the lock makers to promote this idea that locks and safes were like any burglar-proof lock or safe on the market would eventually be defeated by this sophisticated gentleman burglar who had these amazingly scientific methods and tools. And the only defense was to chuck out the old one and get the latest high-tech burglar-proof safe. Of course, most safe breakers weren't dapper, kid-gloved aristocrats. They were people like Tom Christie, bright, adventurous lads who got themselves into trouble. They might have had behavioural difficulties or committed some petty crimes. Some of them were sent off to these boys' homes and these industrial schools just for having poor parents who couldn't afford to look after them in conditions that the government at the time deemed sufficient. And so they're sent off to these institutions. They're isolated from their communities, thrown together with other boys and young adults that have, they're more hardened, they've gone through the system longer, and maybe they would teach them some things they learnt about car conversion or breaking into houses. They were provided little in the way of actually useful education or vocational skills. And this was a system, really, that I need to make a really important distinction with this talk. These are people who would have committed crimes, but that doesn't necessarily mean someone is a criminal. So we're talking about people who might have done some petty thefts, or maybe some acts of violence or disobedience or disorder. They put into a system that eventually turned them into someone who regarded their vocation, their way of making money and supporting themselves, their friend circle, their identity is that of a criminal, where it wasn't before. So let's meet some of these characters. The first one that really comes on the record of people who had a bit of notoriety as a safebreaker in New Zealand was Herbert Allendale. He turned to safebreaking after a long lag in jail, after a long career as a jewel thief. He targeted regional railway stations and post offices. He'd borrow a handcart from some warehouse or store nearby. He'd cart the safe away to a secluded spot and then cut his way through the walls with a chisel and hammer. usually tools that he, again, stole from somewhere else. So he'd then make off with the cash. He'd leave the safe, he'd leave the tools and the cart, and he'd leave identifiable documents like checks that he didn't want to have to deal with. So around the 1880s, 1890s, New Zealand was in a long depression, and the government realised that with this biting and leading more people to consider maybe doing some thefts to make ends meet, they needed to beef up security against safe breakers. So around this time, there was a new generation of burglar-proof safes, and they featured this development of this manganese alloy Hadfield steel. And this patented alloy was really strong against methods like the ones Allendale was using with the chiseling in. It was also really hard to work, which made it really expensive. So these burglar-proof safes, they were available, they were promoted as the best thing against the literally hacking in. But the government instead decided, why don't we just encase them in concrete so people like Allendale can't walk out the door with them? And it was surprisingly effective. And so we sort of see safecracking sort of falling away for a few years, and it sort of comes back around the 1900s, 1910s with these dynamite gangs. And there were around 7 of them who were really active in New Zealand in the early 20th century. So we see Allendale reappearing with some friends he made in prison, targeting South Island railway stations. We've got, so these jobs are really high risk, high reward, so people who did them tended to hold a particular modus operandi, particular set of, an approach to doing it, and try to get good at a particular target and a particular way of breaking these safes. So it was really only the preserve of professionalised criminal gangs at this point, because it required time and research, time to research a target, plan a clean job. You need to get access to explosives, and you needed the knowledge of how to use them safely. So the charge had to be powerful enough to tear through metal or shake the bolts of the safe door open, but not so forceful as to jam the bolt or to set fire to the contents. Of course, an explosion of that magnitude pretty much guarantees somebody would quickly raise the alarm, and so the timing was very important with these jobs for the ability to get in and out. So the successful safecrackers, they really did have to hone their methods to be able to not just do that job and get away safely, but to be able to do the next one and make this a career. Charles Newton's gang was particularly notorious because they had this knack for blowing up safes in busy urban areas without detection. They'd target businesses like drapers or other businesses that had a lot of material around they could put over the safe to dampen the sound. They were famous for one job at a coal yard in downtown Wellington where the explosion had gone off and not woken the caretaker who lived on site, who was asleep at the time. So these stories get written about in the paper because, again, very notorious, everyone's fascinated. And enterprising safe merchants start advertising with these sort of advertorial, they look a bit like they're in the body of the newspaper, sort of blurring that line between editorial and advertisement, basically saying if you don't want to be next, you need to buy our high-tech burglar-proof safes. So were these high-tech safes actually worth it? It kind of depended on who your burglar was. Sidney Gardner was, so he'd spent some time as a miner after industrial school. He knew how to handle dynamite, but he had terrible luck that kind of just left this wake of destruction around the upper North Island. He was interrupted by the burglar alarm during a job at the Smith & Coe in their offices, where after he'd already drilled a hole in the safe to get the dynamite in, he managed to get into the counting house of Kempthorne Cross's Auckland office. He dynamited the safe, but it just jammed the bolts further shut, like the jam, so that the only way to get in was for the people who ran the place to get someone in to basically cut a hole in the side, and he did the same at Paeroa railway station. So, these safes, a safe could potentially cost more than the contents of that safe, so if you have to throw out the safe and buy a new one because someone has tried to blow it unsuccessfully, it can get expensive. Still, there are this steady stream in this period of it's scientific burglars using these methods that technically they were available, but they weren't really practical. Oxyacetylene torches, arc welders, these things in practice with the technology at the time would have taken weeks to actually cut a hole large enough to remove the contents of a safe, which if a burglar alarm is interrupting someone with explosives, it's probably not going to be super reliable as a way to actually breach a safe in real-world conditions. Some of them just are outlandish, like a revolving safe that the oxyacetylene torch can never land on the same spot twice, chemical warfare. In reality, people kept carting safes out of buildings and blowing them up. So basically, these safecracker gangs stopped targeting the kind of businesses that had counting house rooms that had their own bolts on the doors and just started targeting suburban butchers and other businesses that would have the safe that you could stick on a wheelbarrow or a cart or something and take away, and you can take it to a place that you can blow it up. So let's meet another group of incorrigible rogues. This is Paddy Gunn's gang. Paddy Gunn and his friends graduated from teenage loitering, play acting as gangsters, to petty thefts, mostly bicycle conversion. Paddy stole 16 bicycles that, well, he was charged for 16, I don't know how many it was in reality, and he sold them, and he managed to escape a jail sentence because his lawyer pleaded that he was a poor, innocent lad, just a boy really, who had spent all the money on lollies and movie tickets. He had a middle-class family basically willing to vouch for him and pay fines, and so he did avoid the boys' homes to Borstal pipeline. He mostly managed to avoid incarceration, even though he escalated to housebreaking and armed robbery. And so they were very methodical in their targets and their methods. So they went on this absolute spree for most of 1918, and so they broke into a quarry that had gelignite, stole gelignite and blasting caps. They broke into the Electrical Construction Corporation, who was responsible for the hydro works at the time, and stole batteries. They broke into 2 sporting goods stores, stole revolvers and ammunitions. They chose businesses with high cash turnover, like the Tram Corporation, suburban post offices, which acted as banks, and the Government Oyster Depot, which had a monopoly on oysters in Auckland at the time. They were systematic, and they took pains to avoid leaving any forensic evidence. They wore gloves, knowing that fingerprinting was starting to come in as a method of detection, and they even stole cars to transport themselves to and from these jobs so that they would not have their own car spotted on the street. So on 13th of March 1920, somebody broke into Postmaster Augustus Braithwaite's house and shot him dead in St Mary's Bay. They took the Ponsonby post office keys from his pocket, and that night the post office storeroom was cleaned out. Police immediately suspected the gun gang and searched Paddy's family home, where they found blank post office banking deposit slips under a loose floorboard in the bedroom that he shared with his brother Dennis. The search eventually uncovered an empty cash box and a fired revolver in the gully behind their home, and each one of those had a fingerprint that matched Dennis. So now police were really eager to send a strong message on armed robbery, especially one that would escalate to murder. And in spite of evidence of a well-organised, experienced group effort to break into with the shooting of the postmaster and the break-in at Ponsonby Post Office, Dennis Gunn was convicted as the sole perpetrator of both the murder and the break-in, and he was hanged for that crime. It was the first conviction in New Zealand to rely on fingerprint evidence, and it's still held up today by the police as an example of policing done very well. So safecracking was in decline by the 1930s for several reasons, and it's definitely not because locksmiths had finally perfected the burglar-proof safe. If anything, these technologies that we saw in some of those previous newspaper articles about scientific burglary, the welding equipment, the oxyacetylene torches, electric cutters, these were actually more effective and available than they'd been. But the main one was alarms, including silent alarms were now in common use, which really changed the risk profile around getting caught. So also businesses tended to keep less cash on hand as a routine. Businesses, banks basically got better at offering things like personal checkbooks that allowed people to pay with alternatives to cash, which were less desirable to safecrackers. They didn't have to go through the effort of laundering those checks. New Zealand's criminal underworld had a handful of very proficient cracksmen. At this point, we sort of move away from there being gangs per se, like we saw with the dynamite gangs, and we instead have this loosely affiliated network of people who decided to be professional criminals who would team up with each other on an as-needed basis, sort of pushing together various diverse skills. And so there's about 5 or 6 safecrackers among them that might be brought in if someone had a job that was really worth the time and effort. But really, these people were often finding other ways of supporting themselves. So this was the era of 6 o'clock closing of pubs, and so a really popular one was sly grogging, providing after-hour speakeasies that people would go to be able to get a drink after 6 p.m. In New Zealand towns and cities. A lot of them were involved in that. Smugglers, illegal bookies. Archie Banks on the bottom right there, he ran in a legitimate second-hand car dealership that was mostly a money laundering operation, and he was heavily involved with sly grogging and is possibly better known as the father of John Banks, the Tony Steakhouse impresario. So safe jobs like the 1956 Waterfront Commission payroll raid were meticulously planned and executed. This is held up as the biggest, it was definitely the biggest payday for a safe job. So even though the police at this point had really close connections with all of the criminal underworld, it took them more than a year to break the case of this one burglary they'd broken in the night before payday for all of the wharfies in Auckland at the Waterfront Commission. And it took them more than a year to find someone. Eventually they caught a small-time crook called Trevor Nash with some banknotes with the numbers matched banknotes that were known to be in that heist. And like Dennis Gunn, they tried to him as the sole perpetrator of that crime. And just the public wanted a conviction, didn't necessarily care if it was, the one person who'd done that job. He may or may not have been involved, but it was definitely not a one-person job. This one's interesting because they tried gel-igniting the safe. That didn't work, and so they brought in torches to cut the top off. So they had a plan B for if their original operation didn't work. And also 2 different skill sets that often safebreakers tended to have one they preferred, so it's unlikely that one person was a master of both tool sets. Now, I did say that this is not a talk about computers. So none of this is relevant to your professional lives, but it's a tech conference, we should have some takeaways. I think the most important one, anyone who tries to tell you that their latest cutting-edge technology will protect you, they are trying to sell you something. I really have to paraphrase my amazing colleague, Felicity. People will try to protect themselves against the threats they think they deserve, not the threats they have. And people want to think that it's going to be, this dapper cat burglar, sort of sophisticated gentleman cracksman type, and really it's some guy with a wheelbarrow. The risk of getting caught is often a way more effective deterrent than some patent hardened steel. The advice the practical people gave through this period, and it was really borne out as a really effective deterrent, get an alarm, the louder the better. If you want to get into safecracking, get a gang. It's really a team sport. Master cracksmen honed their skills by working with people who had a diverse set of skills and being able to pick one area that worked really well for them, also being able to teach others and transfer that knowledge so that there's a succession, there's a future generation, let other people, find fences and other people who can take care of parts outside of your area of expertise. Don't try to be a master of everything. And also, youth boot camps never made anyone safer. Institutionalizing young people, branding them as criminals, only made them criminals. So, yeah. Again, no relevance to current day. This is a history talk. But yes, there was definitely a youth institutions to master criminals pipeline in all of these stories that absolutely cannot be ignored. And that's it. That's my talk.
I am a super genius.